It was a quiet evening in the small town of Riverview, where life usually moved at a slow and predictable pace. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden hue over the streets, and most of the townspeople were either winding down their day or gathering at the local diner for a meal. Officer Jake Miller, a seasoned law enforcement officer known for his sharp instincts and no-nonsense attitude, was just about to call it a day when a call crackled over his radio. Suspicious activity reported near the old factory, the dispatcher announced, her voice steady but urgent. Jake sighed. The factory had been abandoned for years, a decaying relic of the town's industrial past. It was a magnet for trouble. Teenagers looking for a thrill, drifters seeking shelter, or worse. He knew he couldn't ignore it. Grabbing his keys and adjusting his holster, he headed out, the faint sound of his boots echoing against the asphalt. When Jake arrived at the scene, the air felt different, heavier somehow. The factory loomed in the dim light, its broken windows resembling jagged teeth. He shone his flashlight through the gaping entrance, the beam cutting through the darkness and revealing graffiti-covered walls and scattered debris. As he stepped inside, his trained eyes scanned the surroundings. That's when he heard it. A faint rustling sound, like someone trying to remain unseen. "Riverview Police," Jake called out, his voice firm and authoritative. "Come out where I can see you." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from behind a crumbling pillar, a figure emerged. It was a girl, no older than 18, with disheveled hair, torn clothes, and a defiant look in her eyes. She didn't flinch under the flashlight's glare, but Jake could see the flicker of fear she was trying to hide. "What are you doing here?" Jake demanded, keeping his distance. The girl crossed her arms, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't answer, which only heightened his suspicion. Was she running from something? Hiding something? He glanced around, half expecting others to emerge from the shadows, but there was no one else. "All right, hands where I can see them," Jake said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Reluctantly, the girl complied. He placed her in handcuffs, securing her to one of the old steel pillars. It wasn't standard protocol, but out here, in an isolated spot like this, he couldn't take any chances. "Now let's try this again. What's your name?" He asked, his voice softer this time, hoping to coax some answers out of her. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the floor. "Emily," she mumbled. "Emily what?" She didn't respond. Jake was growing impatient, but there was something about her, a mix of vulnerability and defiance, that made him pause. He decided to search her belongings, which consisted of a small backpack lying nearby. Inside, he found only a few basic items: a water bottle, a notebook, and a phone with a cracked screen. No wallet, no ID, nothing to give him a clue about who she really was. "Emily, who are you running from?" Jake asked, his voice softening even further. The question seemed to hit a nerve. Her eyes flashed with emotion, and for a split second he thought she might tell him. But then she shook her head, her lips sealed tight. Jake was about to radio for backup when something caught his attention. The notebook he'd pulled from her bag had fallen open, revealing a page filled with scribbled names, addresses, and phone numbers. One name stood out, a name that sent a chill down his spine. "Emily," he said slowly, holding up the notebook. "Who is this? Why do you have these names?" Her eyes widened, but she still didn't speak. Jake could feel his pulse quickening. Something was off, very off. He grabbed his radio, intending to call it in, when Emily finally broke her silence. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "You can't call anyone. If they find me, he'll kill me. And if you keep me here, they'll come for me." "Who?" Jake demanded, his voice sharper now. "Who's coming for you?" She looked up at him, her expression a mix of fear and desperation. "My father." Jake froze, his hand hovering over the radio. The way she said it, the weight behind those two words, sent a ripple of unease through him. He was about to press her for more when his phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a text from the station, a simple message with a name and a question mark. Asterisk, asterisk, Do you have her asterisk asterisk? Jake's heart skipped a beat. Whoever this girl was, she wasn't just a runaway. And whoever her father was, he wasn't someone to be taken lightly. For the first time in years, Jake felt genuinely unnerved. He looked at Emily, still cuffed to the pillar, her eyes locked on his. "Who is your father?" he asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. The answer, when it came, would shake him to his core. Jake's question hung in the air like a storm cloud, but Emily didn't answer. Instead, she lowered her gaze, her shoulders trembling slightly, as if the very mention of her father was too much to bear. Jake's mind raced. Who could this man be? A criminal? A politician? Someone powerful enough to make this young girl so terrified yet so reluctant to talk. The name in the notebook kept flashing in his mind. He flipped through the pages again, scanning the scribbled notes, addresses, and dates. They weren't random. There was a pattern to them, a connection Jake couldn't quite piece together yet. His instincts told him these weren't just names of friends or classmates. This was bigger, much bigger. Emily, Jake said firmly, taking a knee to meet her eye level. If you don't tell me who he is, I can't help you. Right now, you're not in trouble, but if you're mixed up in something dangerous, I need to know. Are these names connected to him? Her head jerked up, and for the first time, Jake saw a spark of anger in her eyes. You don't get it, she said through gritted teeth. You asterisk can't asterisk help me. Nobody can. And if you think keeping me here will fix anything, you're wrong. He'll find me. He always does. The conviction in her voice sent a chill down Jake's spine. This wasn't teenage dramatics or rebellion. This was real, bone-deep fear. Jake leaned back, running a hand through his hair, trying to think. He wasn't the kind of cop who scared easily, but something about this situation was shaking him. He could feel it in his gut, a sense that he'd stumbled into something far beyond the usual small-town trouble. His phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his thoughts. This time, it wasn't a text. It was a call from the station. He hesitated before answering, his eyes still locked on Emily. Yeah, Miller here, he said, stepping a few feet away. Jake, the voice on the other end said, low and tense. It was the sheriff, a grizzled man named Roy Bennett, who'd been running the Riverview Police Department for decades. We've got a situation. Jake frowned. What kind of situation? There was a pause, and Jake could hear the faint sound of typing in the background. We just got a call from a federal agency, Roy said finally. They're asking about a girl. Matches the description of the one you brought in. They didn't give me many details, but they were insistent. Jake's grip tightened on the phone. What agency? Didn't say, Roy replied, his voice gruff. Just said they'd be sending someone out to talk to us. Said to keep her secure and not let anyone near her. Jake glanced back at Emily, who was now sitting cross-legged on the ground, her face buried in her hands. She looked so small and vulnerable, a stark contrast to the storm she seemed to have brought with her. Roy, Jake said cautiously, I think there's more to this than they're telling us. I found something in her bag, a notebook with names and addresses. I don't know what it means yet, but it feels organized, like she's been keeping track of something. Don't get ahead of yourself, Roy warned. Just sit tight and wait for the suits to show up. They'll handle it. Jake hung up, frustration gnawing at him. He hated being told to sit tight, especially when his instincts were screaming at him to dig deeper. But he also knew better than to ignore the chain of command. For now, he'd have to wait. Returning to Emily, he crouched down again, keeping his voice calm but firm. The truth's going to come out sooner or later, he said. If you tell me now, I might be able to protect you. But if you keep shutting me out, I can't promise what will happen when those feds show up. Emily looked up, her face pale, but her eyes hard. You think they're here to help? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. They're not. They're just as dangerous as he is. Maybe worse. Jake didn't know what to say to that. He'd dealt with his share of shady characters in law enforcement, but the way Emily spoke made it sound like she'd seen things he couldn't even imagine. The weight of her words hung heavy between them, filling the quiet factory with an oppressive tension. Just then, a sound broke through the stillness. A low rumble in the distance. Jake turned his head toward the entrance, listening. It was faint, but growing louder, the unmistakable hum of engines approaching. "Stay here," Jake said, rising to his feet. He moved toward the entrance, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. Peering out into the fading light, he saw them. 2 black SUVs rolling down the dirt road toward the factory, their windows tinted so dark they might as well have been painted. Jake's heart rate quickened. These weren't your average government-issue vehicles. They were too sleek, too polished. Whoever was inside wasn't here for a routine check-in. The SUVs came to a stop 100 yards away, and the doors opened in unison. 4 men stepped out, dressed in dark suits and sunglasses, despite the fact that the sun had nearly disappeared below the horizon. They moved with precision, like a team used to working together. Jake's hand tightened on his gun. "Officer Miller," one of them called out, his voice smooth but commanding. "We're here for the girl." Jake stepped out into the open, keeping his expression neutral. "I wasn't told to expect you," he said, his tone carefully measured. "Mind showing me some ID?" The man who'd spoken smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a badge, holding it up for Jake to see. It looked legitimate. Department of Homeland Security. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "We'll take it from here," the man said, slipping the badge back into his pocket. "You've done your job, officer. We appreciate it." Jake didn't move. "What's going on here?" he asked. "Why is she so important?" The man's smile faded. "That's classified. Now, if you'll kindly step aside, we'll handle the rest." Jake's mind raced. Every fiber of his being told him not to hand Emily over, but he was just one cop in a small town. What could he realistically do against a team of federal agents? Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that if he let them take her, he'd be making a terrible mistake. "I need to see a warrant," Jake said finally, standing his ground. "You can't just take her without proper documentation." The man's expression darkened, and the air seemed to grow colder. "Officer Miller," he said, his voice low and menacing, "you're not in a position to make demands. Step aside. Now." Before Jake could respond, a sharp cry echoed from inside the factory. "Emily." Without thinking, he turned and ran back inside, his heart pounding. When he reached her, he found her struggling against the handcuffs, her face pale with terror. "They're here, aren't they?" she said, her voice trembling. "You can't let them take me. Please." Jake hesitated for only a moment before making a decision that would change everything. He pulled out his key and unlocked the cuffs. "Come on," he said, grabbing her arm. "We're getting out of here." Emily didn't argue. Together, they darted toward the back of the factory, the sound of footsteps growing louder behind them. Jake didn't know where they were going or how this would end, but one thing was clear. The men outside weren't the good guys, and now they were out of time. Jake guided Emily through the maze of rusted machinery and crumbling walls, his mind racing. The factory's layout was burned into his memory from years of patrolling the area. He knew of a service exit at the back, an old steel door that led out to a narrow alley. If they could reach it without being seen, they might have a chance. Behind them, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the cavernous space. The men were inside now, their voices low but urgent. Jake couldn't make out what they were saying, but he didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to confirm one thing. They weren't here to follow protocol. They were here to take Emily by any means necessary. "Keep quiet," Jake whispered, leading her around a massive metal press covered in decades of grime. Emily nodded, her wide eyes darting nervously around the shadows. She clutched her backpack tightly, as if it were the only thing grounding her in the chaos. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate. Jake motioned for Emily to crouch behind a stack of wooden pallets as he peeked around the corner. 2 of the men were sweeping the area with flashlights, their beams slicing through the darkness. They moved with military precision, checking every possible hiding spot. Jake knew It was only a matter of time before they found them. Emily tugged at his sleeve, her voice barely audible. "They won't stop until they have me." Jake glanced back at her. "Why? What do they want with you?" Her lips parted as if to answer, but she hesitated, shaking her head. "I can't. If I tell you, it'll put you in even more danger." Jake exhaled sharply. "Emily, I'm already in it. You think I'm just going to hand you over. If you want me to help you, I need to know what's going on." Before she could respond, a sharp metallic clang echoed through the factory. Jake turned just in time to see one of the men knocking over a pile of scrap metal, his flashlight beam sweeping dangerously close to their hiding spot. Time was running out. Jake pulled Emily to her feet. "Let's go." They moved quickly but silently, weaving through the labyrinth of old equipment. The service door was just ahead, its outline barely visible in the dim light. Jake reached for the handle, praying it wasn't locked. It wasn't. The door creaked open, and a rush of cool night air hit them. They slipped out into the alley, closing the door behind them as quietly as they could. For a moment, they stood there, catching their breath. The alley was narrow and dark, the perfect place to stay hidden. But Jake knew it wouldn't be long before the men realized they were gone. "This way," he said, leading Emily down the alley toward the main road. They needed a car, a plan, anything that could put some distance between them and their pursuers. Jake's patrol car was parked out front, but it was too risky to go back. The SUVs would be there, along with the men. He needed another option. As they reached the end of the alley, Jake spotted an old pickup truck parked near a row of dumpsters. The windows were rolled down, and the keys were dangling from the ignition. It wasn't the most ethical move, but desperate times called for desperate measures. "Get in," Jake said, motioning for Emily to climb into the passenger seat. "You're stealing a truck?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "Borrowing," Jake corrected, sliding into the driver's seat. "I'll return it, probably." He turned the key, and the engine roared to life. As he pulled out onto the road, he caught a glimpse of the factory in his rearview mirror. The men were outside now, scanning the area. One of them raised a hand to his earpiece, likely relaying their escape to someone higher up. Jake pressed down on the gas, putting as much distance as he could between them and the factory. For a while, neither of them spoke. The truck rattled over potholes as Jake navigated the back roads, heading away from town. His mind was a whirlwind of questions, but he didn't want to push Emily too hard. She was clearly terrified, and the last thing he wanted was to lose her trust. Finally, she broke the silence. "He's not my real father," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake glanced at her. "What do you mean?" "He's the man who raised me," she explained, staring out the window. "But he's not my biological dad. I found out when I was 10. Overheard a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. That's when everything started to make sense. Why he was so controlling. Why he never let me have a normal life." Jake frowned. "Controlling how?" Emily hesitated, then took a deep breath. "He's powerful. He works with people. Dangerous people. I don't know all the details, but I know enough. He used to tell me it was for my own good, that he was protecting me. But it wasn't protection. It was control. I wasn't allowed to leave the house without him knowing where I was. I couldn't have friends, couldn't go to school. He homeschooled me, but even that was more about keeping me isolated than educating me." Jake tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "And the notebook? The names and addresses, what are they?" She shifted uncomfortably. "They're people he's connected to. I started keeping track a couple of years ago, whenever I overheard him on the phone or saw something I wasn't supposed to. I thought, maybe someday I could use it, if I ever got away." Jake processed her words, his mind racing. If what she was saying was true, then her father wasn't just some overbearing parent. He was involved in something much darker. And now those men in suits were after her, likely under his orders. "Why did you run?" Jake asked. "What happened?" Emily swallowed hard. "I found something. Something I wasn't supposed to. A file on his computer. It had my name on it, but it wasn't just about me. It was about experiments. Tests. I didn't know the full story, but it was enough to scare me. I knew I had to leave. Jake's stomach churned. Experiments. Tests. This was starting to sound like something out of a conspiracy theory, but the fear in Emily's voice was real. And so were the men chasing her. "What about your mother?" Jake asked gently. "Where is she in all of this?" Emily's face darkened. "She left when I was little. Or at least, that's what he told me. I don't know if it's true. I don't even know if she's alive." Jake nodded, his jaw tightening. He felt a surge of anger, not at Emily, but at the situation. At the man who had stolen her childhood and dragged her into whatever twisted web he was involved in. "We'll figure this out," he said, his voice steady. "But we need to keep moving. If those guys find us, they won't stop." Emily interrupted, her voice trembling. "Not until they have me, or I'm dead." Jake glanced at her, his chest tightening. "That's not going to happen," he said firmly. "Not on my watch." But even as he said the words, a flicker of doubt crept in. He was in uncharted territory, up against forces he didn't fully understand. And with every mile they put between themselves and Riverview, he knew the stakes were only getting higher. The night stretched on, the truck bouncing along the back roads as Jake pushed it farther into the unknown. The map on his phone was of little help. He avoided main highways and stuck to routes he knew would be harder to track. The tension in the cab was palpable, the silence broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of Emily shifting in her seat. She clutched her backpack tightly, her knuckles white, as if letting go would mean losing control of the one thing she had left. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that every mile brought them closer to something inevitable, something dangerous. His mind churned with possibilities, trying to piece together the puzzle of who Emily's father was and why these men were so desperate to find her. His gut told him they were running out of time. "You have somewhere specific in mind?" Jake asked, keeping his voice even. His eyes flicked between the road and the rearview mirror, scanning for headlights. Emily hesitated. "There's a place," she said softly. "A safe house. Someone I know told me about it. It's not far, maybe another 30 miles. "Safe house?" Jake repeated, frowning. "Who told you about it?" "A friend," she said, her voice tightening. "Someone who helped me get this far. She said if anything went wrong, I should head there, that they could protect me." Jake considered her words, weighing the risk. If this friend was trustworthy, the safe house might be their best chance. But if it was a setup, if the people chasing them knew about it, then they could be walking straight into a trap. "All right," Jake said after a moment. "But if anything feels off, we keep moving. Deal?" Emily nodded, her grip on the backpack relaxing slightly. "Deal." The truck sped on, the road ahead disappearing into darkness. Jake couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, even though they hadn't seen another vehicle for miles. He chalked it up to paranoia, until he noticed a faint glimmer of light in the distance behind them. Headlights. "Hang on," Jake said, his voice tense. He pressed down on the accelerator, the truck's engine groaning in protest. The headlights grew brighter, drawing closer with alarming speed. Emily turned to look, her face pale. "Is it them?" "Probably," Jake muttered, his eyes fixed on the mirror. "Hold on." The truck careened around a bend, its tires skidding on loose gravel. Jake cursed under his breath. The pickup wasn't built for speed, and whoever was behind them had a clear advantage. He needed to think fast. Ahead, the road split into two directions. A paved route that led toward the next town, and a narrow dirt trail that disappeared into the woods. Jake didn't hesitate. He veered onto the dirt trail, the truck bouncing violently as it left the pavement. Branches scraped against the sides of the cab, and the headlights behind them disappeared momentarily as the pursuing vehicle slowed to make the turn. "Are you sure about this?" Emily asked, her voice trembling as she gripped the door handle. "Not even a little," Jake replied, steering the truck through the dense forest. The trees closed in around them, their shadows stretching like claws in the moonlight. Jake turned off the headlights, plunging them into near-total darkness. it was a risky move, but might buy them a few seconds to disappear. The truck jolted over a hidden route, nearly throwing them out of their seats. Jake swore under his breath, keeping one hand steady on the wheel. Behind them, the faint glow of headlights reappeared, weaving through the trees like ghostly lanterns. "They're still coming?" Emily whispered, her voice filled with dread. Jake's mind raced. The dirt trail was getting narrower, the trees pressing closer. If they didn't find a clearing soon, they'd be cornered. Then he saw it, a break in the trees up ahead, a faint glow of open space. He gunned the engine, pushing the truck toward the clearing. When they burst through the tree line, Jake slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a halt, kicking up a cloud of dust. In the dim moonlight, he saw what lay ahead. An old wooden bridge spanning a deep ravine. The planks looked weathered, and the supports groaned faintly under the weight of the wind. "Are you kidding me?" Emily said, staring at the bridge. Jake didn't answer. He threw the truck into reverse, trying to back up, but it was too late. The pursuing vehicle, a sleek black SUV, emerged from the woods, its high beams cutting through the dust. Jake shielded his eyes, squinting at the men stepping out. 3 of them, armed and moving with the precision of a tactical unit. "Stay behind me," Jake said, reaching for his sidearm. He stepped out of the truck, keeping his weapon at his side but ready. The men didn't speak, their expressions hidden behind the glare of the headlights. One of them raised a hand, signaling for Jake to lower his weapon. "Officer Miller," the man called out, his voice calm but commanding. "You don't need to make this any harder. Hand over the girl, and we'll forget this ever happened." Jake squared his shoulders. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're not taking her." The man sighed, as if disappointed. "You're outnumbered, outgunned. This doesn't need to get messy." Behind Jake, Emily peeked out from the passenger side of the truck. Her gaze darted between the men and the bridge, calculating something. Then she did something that caught Jake completely off guard. She grabbed her backpack and bolted toward the bridge. "Emily!" Jake shouted, spinning around. The men reacted instantly, raising their weapons and moving toward her. Jake didn't think. He fired a warning shot into the air, the sharp crack echoing through the ravine. The men hesitated, their focus shifting back to him. "Next one won't be a warning," Jake said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Emily reached the bridge, her footsteps echoing on the creaking planks. She stopped halfway across, turning to face them. Her chest heaved as she clutched the straps of her backpack. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice trembling but defiant. "If you come any closer, I'll—" She didn't finish the sentence. A low rumble filled the air, followed by the groan of the bridge's aging supports. The weight of her words, the tension of the moment, and the fragility of the situation hung in the air like a taut wire about to snap. Jake's heart pounded as he realized they were all standing on the brink of the bridge, of the truth, of whatever this nightmare would reveal next. And he knew, without a doubt, that the next move would change everything.